The history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been overwhelmingly complicated and emotional for both, rooted in decades of fear, anger, mistrust, and war. October 7th brought this crisis to the world stage, with Israelis telling the world, never again, and Palestinians telling the world, free Palestine. The war that ensued after the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel has divided the United States, divided the world. Today, the future of the Middle East is uncertain and unsettled. Here in the U.S., there is anxiety and fear from both Jews and Muslims, as both hope for a sustainable peace in the Middle East. Southern California has the largest Muslim population and the second largest Jewish population in the U.S. And here in the greater LA area, people of both faiths live together, work together, coexist. Can this coexistence ever be achieved in the Mideast? Is there a sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Here is part one of my two-part interview with CAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. CAIR is one of the most well-known Muslim activist organizations in the United States. I recently traveled to Orange County, California to meet with Hussam Ayloush. Hussam is the CEO of CAIR California and the executive director of its Greater LA office. Hussam Ayloush with CAIR, the Council on American-Islamic Relations. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.
It's actually been several years since we visited with each other, so I appreciate this.
I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity.
I should let our viewers know this is somewhat of a bit of a different format for the interview. Normally, if you're a fan of Sustaining Us, we have two representative arguments. I sort of moderate and we go from there. We have field reports and such. Possibly you can explain to our audience why we have a bit of a different format, and then we get to the issues, Hussam.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for the invitation. Truly, I've been on interviews with various media outlets, and they tend to be very aggressive, confrontational, and I don't think we do service to the audiences, to the viewers. Knowing you, I've known you for 20 years. We don't agree on a lot of things dealing with the Middle East. We agree on at least humanity. And I felt when you approached me about the idea, having a dialogue was way more productive for the subject and for the interest of the viewership you have, for us to have that dialogue instead of a confrontation with a third party. You know me, I know you. Even if we don't agree, I know we're going to respect each other's opinions and civility.
And you asked for a one-on-one interview, and I granted that request because to me, this is too vital an issue, whether you agree or disagree with Palestinians or Israelis, Jews, Muslims, whatever the case may be. This is a conversation that must be had. This is a dialogue that must be told. And I said, yes, I agree to the format, and that's fine. So getting into our first question, it's been a lot of pain and suffering for both Israelis and Palestinians. Certainly it was brought to the forefront of the world stage, as I mentioned just a moment ago, October 7th, Hamas attack on Israel. There's a lot of history. Somewhere there has to be a solution. Let's begin with your take on things, and let's try to present facts to this argument. Let's let the viewer decide and have a dialogue and a discussion, because I know there's a great mutual respect for each other.
Sure. Well, thank you. I mean, the first thing to remember is, one, we have to acknowledge that every human life is sacred, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, Israeli, and I think that's a given, but sometimes we have to make that point clear. Anyone who's an innocent person, man, woman, or children, or child, should be protected and deserving of that. But second point after that is immediately going to the fact that this battle, this conflict, this war that is happening today did not begin on October 7th, not even on October 6th or 5th. This has been going on for over 100 years, even before the establishment of the State of Israel 76 plus years ago. This is about the dispossession of the Palestinian people on their own land by decisions or through decisions made by foreign occupiers, you know, the British mandate, even a decision by the UN deciding the fate of a land or the land where a people lived still does not make it a justified, legitimate, or less painful of a dispossession. So unless we go back to that history from the beginning of what happened and how we can address that ongoing, it's not just 100-year or at least 76-year-old injustice, but it's an ongoing injustice that have caused a lot of lives and misery, mostly for the Palestinian people.
And yet there is the argument, and thank you for that, when you say possession or dispossession of land, so to speak, there are those who are going to greatly argue that this was the Jewish ancestral land for centuries and centuries, and they were kicked off their homeland by, let's say, the Persians and the Turks and the Romans and the Arabs, et cetera, the list goes on. When you dissect it from that perspective and you try to decipher whose land is this anyway, obviously the land was greatly contested prior to 1948 in statehood of Israel, and yet you are correct in that Palestinians and Israelis sort of coexisted, right? They shared the commonality of the land, but it was certainly in question, whose land is it? So whether you agree or you disagree with the then British mandate, which led to the United Nations partition of the land, which split Israel in half, basically, the Palestinians were allowed to take their half for eventual statehood. The Israelis could take their half. In 1948, certainly no sooner than Israel declares statehood, the entire Arab world swarms down on Israel and says, no, you're not allowed. They tried to annihilate and exterminate Israel and the Jews fought back and said, so soon after World War II and the 6 million Jews killed in the concentration camps, they said never again. They took that land and they said, until we are recognized as equal partners as a state, we have the right to exist. There is no existential threat. We have that land and we will relinquish the land. But since 1948, it's been constant warfare, everyone trying to annihilate Israel. And many ask, what is Israel supposed to do?
Sure. I mean, first of all, from a historical and legal perspective, we have to separate two things. I don't think anybody with any basic knowledge, minimal knowledge of history, denies the fact that Jews existed on that land and lived as part of the indigenous people, along with the Canaanites, the Palestinians, the Arabs, tribes that existed there, along many people there. But we're talking about 2,000-3,000 years old history. Since then, the last time there was that presence is about 2,000 years ago. If we are to use that 2,000-year-old history to come back from thousands of miles away from that place, I would be claiming a lot of land in a lot of places in the world, including Palestine. Being a Muslim, being an Arab, you know, Muslims have heritage as well as Christians. We don't operate in this world based on, hey, 2,000 years ago, I'm sure one of my ancestors, and I did my DNA and I have like 20 different nationalities. Imagine if I show up to Central Asians or Albanian places or Turkish places and say, all right, everybody pack up and leave, because 2,000 years ago, I have proof my ancestors lived there, and find a place, or let's split up your land. No people in the world. I mean, I think Palestinians are not different. And I'm not Palestinian, so it's easier for me to talk about.
Give your background in 30 seconds anyway.
Sure.
I know you're Lebanese, of course.
Sure. My parents are both of Syrian origin, who lived in Lebanon. I was born in Lebanon. Came here as a teenager to go to college in Texas, married into a Latina lady. So you can imagine how mixed my kids are. I'm already very mixed with Arabic, Turkish, Central Asian, partly even European DNAs, if that is something we can look into.
Who knows? Maybe there's a little bit of Jewish in you too. We don't know.
Everybody I know has at least 1% or 2%, because again, we're all mixed. Nobody is pure anything, quote unquote, if we can even use the word pure. So for me, I'm looking at it less about that purity, more about as a justification to claim some land. Palestinians, again, are not different than any other people, where actually I do believe they're among some of the most hospitable people, very generous people. When Jews were being persecuted in Europe, especially after the Holocaust, and even before that there was a lot of persecution, people forget about that. Palestinians opened their homes and their land and their hearts to welcome a lot of these refugees. And up till then, it wasn't the issue. It is when, in the late 1800s, you're talking about probably the population, the Jewish population of historic Palestine was anywhere from 5, maybe at most 10%. It wasn't until World War II happening and the aftermath, where an influx of refugees arrived, maybe increasing the number of the Jewish presence in Palestine to something close to 30%. Now imagine if you are a Palestinian at that time. And by the way, when we say Palestinian, at least from a Muslim or Arab perspective, for us, it does not automatically mean only Muslim or Christian. A Palestinian is anyone who's indigenous to the historic land of Palestine who lived there. They could be Druze, Muslim, Christian, or Jewish too.
Certainly.
Or even of Armenian background or Greek background. So imagine being that Palestinian who suddenly in 1948 or 1947, when the partition was being discussed, seeing that 30% of the people who are Jewish now, who own about 7% of the land, not more, suddenly are given more than the majority, almost 55%, 56% of that historic Palestine. One can see why they would reject it, because they were never consulted about that decision.
And I hear you, but to give it just a bit more context, and correct me if I'm wrong, certainly, the land was contested only in the simple fact that it exchanged hands so many times, and there had to be made a decision for both the humanitarian rights and the civil rights of both the Palestinians and both the Jews. And the world eventually recognized that both needed a two-state solution. For more reference, obviously for our viewers, certainly Jews throughout history for thousands of years, they were basically unwanted guests wherever they went. They were ran out of every country. There were inquisitions, pogroms, the Holocaust, and so on. Thus, we have the diaspora of Jews. You can travel all throughout the world, and whether you're in Morocco or Iran or in Iraq or Syria or all over Europe, there is a tiny fraction of a Jewish population because Jews had no homeland. They were kicked out and persecuted, prosecuted no matter where they went. So in fairness, the UN governing body, and certainly powers that be in the 1800s and Zionists, which I hope we can get into Zionism in just a moment because I think that's certainly mislabeled, the world agreed that there's got to be a two-state solution. So in leading to the UN partition, the world eventually, somewhat begrudgingly, but eventually accepted the two-state solution, a statehood for Palestine, a state of declaration for Jews. The Arab world said no. Truth be told, the Arab world said no Jews allowed. End of story, and that is how it has been. Over the decades, Israeli leadership and prime ministers have in good faith tried to broker peace with the PLO, then Yasser Arafat of the PLO, Mahmoud Abbas, Hamas, whomever. Bill Clinton worked himself to near exhaustion, near death, if you go back in history and read about it, to get the Oslo Accords. The world was so close to a unification where the Palestinians could have these human rights in the statehood, Israelis could be recognized and lived in peace. And at the 11th hour, Hussam, Yasser Arafat said no. He withdrew. And it was heartbreaking because in the final analysis, he sort of fooled the world. Everyone bought into the fact that there's going to be a relationship and a two-state solution. But he knew, and there was great pressure from Hamas on the PLO and Yasser Arafat, to be fair. I believe at one point his heart could have been in the right place and he wanted to make peace. His life would have been in vain as a martyr. He was the Israel slayer, the Jew slayer, so to speak, the Palestinian protector. He could not go through with that peace. And since then, no Palestinian leader has. And it's heartbreaking because now, yes, Israel has used a land grab to get hostages back or to have peace or to say, just recognize it. And really, what is Israel's greatest crime? They are asking, just don't annihilate us, don't exterminate us. Let us have the right to live here, because if you look at the reality of it, Israel would like nothing more than to have peace with its neighbor, to have a two-state solution. Gaza could be an amazing 22-mile stretch like Miami Beach. Israelis would be no happier to help them build that. They don't want to be annihilated because Palestinians, Muslims in that region, they deserve human rights. They deserve to not suffer anymore. But that suffering is from Hamas. Hamas keeps them in an open-air prison. Israel has relinquished a lot of the border. They have withdrawn from Gaza. They have tried to make as much of a concession as they can. And it breaks my heart, I say that again, that the leadership of Hamas and the Palestinians cannot help their own people. They are given billions of dollars a year from the EU and from the United States. Yes, President Trump had put a halt on that. Biden reinstated the money to them. And instead of building an infrastructure of mosques and daycare centers and high schools and colleges and bridges and roads, they build an underground intricate tunnel system to fight Israel. How about building an above ground infrastructure for their own people who are suffering, because these Palestinians are suffering and they need a state?
So much to unpack here.
Yes.
Starting first with the claim or assertion that the land was contested. The land was never contested. What changed was not the people or the land. What changed was who was ruling over the people. That happens all over the world. You know, just because we ruled over Vietnam, it doesn't mean the land of Vietnam was contested. Just because France colonized Algeria or Morocco or Mauritania, it means the land was contested. It just means some occupiers came in, and you know, or authorities came in, come and go. Persians, Romans, Ottomans, Ayyubis, British mandate, etc., etc. The land were the same. So I would just want to, and I don't want to dwell on the past, but it's important for us to know when we're looking at it, it wasn't a typical civil war. It wasn't a typical, you have foreign community coming from Europe, mostly from East Europe, coming in suddenly to a land where people actually lived. Muslims, Christians, Jews lived in harmony. I still hear stories from my parents. I hear stories about their Jewish neighbors, Jewish business partners. I just came back a couple of months ago from Morocco. I went to the Jewish market. I saw how thriving they are. And I know there is a sense of insecurity. Many in the Jewish community feel, and maybe I can say rightly so, because history, and especially modern history, has not been gracious to the Jewish community, especially what we saw in Europe. But if you speak to Jewish people who lived, obviously, in the Middle East, people before the situation happened in Palestine and Israel, people were neighbors, were friends. They celebrated their holidays together. If we read the history of the golden age of Judaism in history books, in Jewish history books, we read about Muslims and Jews and Christians living together in harmony in Andalusia. You know, some of the best scholars of Judaism thrived in that era of Muslim rule, for example. This is not to say it's perfect, but I'm saying is we've had many positive, bright spots, and we can still have that, because for me and for most Muslims, the conflict that exists today is not a Muslim-Jewish one. My issue, or probably if you speak to Palestinians, their issue is not with the Palestinian people, with the Jewish people as Palestinians. They are with foreign colonizers who settled in their land and occupied their land and dispossessed them from their right to exist. Now, with that is history. I want to come back to what you're talking about in the present. Few things. I mean, you mentioned Israel would not want for anything more than having peace. I don't think that is Israel. I think that is you, David. You're a kind-hearted person, and I appreciate that. And God knows, I truly believe and hope for the same thing. Everything Israel has done since the day of the establishment of the State of Israel has been a nakba, a dispossession, a catastrophe for the Palestinian people. Israel literally destroyed 400 villages. These are not the acts of a peaceful nation. Israel forced 750,000 Palestinians out of their homes and told them, you're not to come back. In our day, we call that ethnic cleansing. We call that genocidal behavior. We're not even talking about what is happening in Gaza. We're talking about, and one might say, well, it's a war, it's an establishment, but Israel hasn't stopped. Israel has had every opportunity to announce, we're allowing a Palestinian state. We're allowing Palestinians to come back to their homes. It breaks my heart when I meet Palestinian friends and they introduce me to their grandparents, and the first thing they do is show me a key of their home, their house in Jaffa, in Haifa, in cities where they lived and thrived, and they're denied. The only reason they're not allowed to come back to their home is because they're not Jewish. That's the only reason, nothing else. So is the problem Hamas? Is the problem Hezbollah? Well, let's ask ourselves, when did Hamas come to existence? In 1987. Were the Palestinian rights protected before 1987? The answer is no. Were Palestinians allowed to rule their own affairs? No. Was Israel expanding its control, very brutal control, over their land in the West Bank and in Gaza? Absolutely. When was Hezbollah established? In 1982, as a result of a brutal Israeli invasion. I was in Lebanon at that time. My own school was bombed by the Israelis. My own high school. There was no Hezbollah at that time. And trust me, I've criticized Hezbollah till my face turned blue because of what they've done in Syria against Syrian people who are, again, like Palestinians, seeking to live free on their land. But this does not excuse what Israel has done in Lebanon, but that's a whole different story. But at least the West Bank and Gaza. Israel has an opportunity. It had it, it continues to have it, to end the occupation. Because as long as there is an occupation, this is history. There will always be a resistance. And the uglier and the more brutal the occupation is, the uglier and the more brutal the resistance to that occupation is going to be.
And I hear you, and thank you for that, and I appreciate you. Let me counter that with some facts as well, because many scholars you talk to, I've talked to on both sides, will often admit, often reluctantly, that the occupation is from within Gaza. And you said, well, within Hamas, excuse me, and you said it only began the last few decades. You have to take into consideration there was a PLO, and before Yasser Arafat, there was a faction in Palestine. And so I have traveled to Israel often, as you know, we've talked about that. And I have interviewed or talked off the record, on the record, so many Israelis, so many Palestinians, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, Arab Muslims. Everyone has said to me the same stories. You have a personal story, I have a personal story. They all say, David, life is so much better here in Israel. And everyone wants to say Israel's the occupier. Israel is the only nation of 22 Arab nations, 22 Arab nations that surround Israel that say, you know what? Get your citizenship, join us in Israel. I mean, on the Israeli Congress, our version of Congress is their Knesset. You have Muslims, you have Arabs, you have Palestinians, either on the Knesset, running for office, living peacefully and saying that their life has never been better in Israel. And they all say the same thing, unless Hamas and Hezbollah are dismantled and there is a more reformative system of government justice. Even Mahmoud Abbas, they try to say, well, he's somewhat of a moderate. He's not, because he has not brokered peace. I think that in part, sometimes it has to be looked at very objectively and not subjectively. And when people use the term Zionist, and it's the Zionist regime and it's an occupation, there is an occupation, but Hamas is occupying its own people, and that is going to have to change. Zionism simply means that there is always going to be a homeland for the Jews, Jews that were kicked out of every country they ever tried to live in. And they finally said, we have to have our homeland. But it's not to say we're not going to allow others in. It's just saying we have our statehood. Italians have a homeland, Iranians have a homeland, Iraqis have a homeland, Lebanese have a homeland, Syrians have a homeland. Israelis are saying, for our own survival, history repeats itself as it always has. October 7th is an example. I'm sorry, but it is an example. And they're saying the existential threat is not recognizing that we exist. And I'm sure you have encountered similar stories where many people you speak with say their life has been amazing in Israel, and once they left Gaza or the Palestinian territories, as it's referred to, they said life has been greatly improved. So this argument, and I hear you and I appreciate it, it can be skewed and it can be subjective, and we have to find a solution. There has been no country in the entire Arab world that has said to the Palestinians, hey, cross our border and live with us. The Egyptians said, no way, no Palestinians here. Lebanon said no. Jordan said no. Syria said no. And Israel said, yes.
Sure. And by the way, two truths can be correct at the same time. There's no debate. The treatment of Palestinians in Israel is much better than the way it is in most Arab countries. That is only because most of these Arab countries are run by corrupt, brutal, repressive regimes in general. I don't want to say all of them, but a big majority of them, safely. But that's not a great standard to compare, for Israel to compare itself. Because Israel continues to be, according to every human rights organization, from Amnesty to Human Rights Watch to Israeli B'Tselem Human Rights Organization, Israel still imposes some form of an apartheid system on people who are not Jewish. This is not a debatable issue. There are two sets of laws in Israel. Jews are favored. In a way, to use modern day language, it is a Jewish supremacist country. People cannot I know cringe when they hear the word supremacy, but it is. It gives more rights and less rights based on what you claim to be. Simple one is what's known as the law of return. I can be a Russian Jew. I can be a convert, by the way. I can today decide to convert to Judaism, and I can have a process of going back, quote unquote, to Israel because of the Jewish connection that I have. Palestinians who might have traced their existence in that land for centuries, with deeds of land and property cannot have that land because they're not Jewish. But I want to go back into, yes, Israel has some form of a democracy. There's no debate. It's a democracy that favors one group over the other. We know of another country that had a beautiful democracy that also favored one group over the other. It's called South Africa under apartheid. And I know a lot of my Jewish friends cringe when I do that. But the reality is, unless we address some of the realities on the ground, and I don't disagree, those Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians and Jews inside of Israel proper have a better treatment or receive a better treatment than probably how Palestinians are treated in Lebanon, in Syria, and in many other places. But what I want to get back, because you mentioned a few points, David. One is, why haven't Arab countries taken Palestinians back or into their land and giving them citizenship? Why should they? Why should they fix and clean up Israel's problem? Israel created this problem. Imagine if I flip that and say, why aren't the Jews of Israel packing up and going to the US? Because I have no doubt my country, the US, would be more than willing to open its borders and welcome Israeli refugees. Shall we blame Israeli Jews for refusing to leave? No. People get attached to a land.
Let's advance the story and fast forward. We must talk about solutions. Since October 7th, horrible, horrific pain and suffering, Israelis, Palestinians, etc. Begin with what you view as a logical and attainable solution.
Well, in order for us to talk about a solution, we need to first address who is part of that solution. We have Palestinians and Israelis who obviously own their own affairs. We can't mandate on them. But there's a role that we as Americans, government or people, can do to help create the positive conditions for that peace. We haven't done that. As a US, if anything, we've kind of sent, instead of peace, we've sent weaponry, we've sent political, diplomatic support, economic support that only enforces the occupation, enforces the marginalization and dehumanization of Palestinians. So that is something we can talk, obviously we're talking to a viewership that is American, and we have a role to play. One, to humanize both sides, humanize Israelis, Palestinians, and be part of the solution rather than cheering for war on either side. Now, for the Palestinians and the Israelis, they're going to need leadership that will be accepting of peace. And I'm not claiming the Palestinians have been shouting for peace and rallying for peace over the years, but I also understand why, because they haven't been offered anything other than crumbs. In reality, Israel, since 1967, since it occupied the West Bank and Gaza, has had an opportunity to say, we're here to help you establish a Palestinian state. It hasn't. What it has done is slowly grabbing more of the land of the Palestinians, taking that land. And this is way long before Hamas came to existence. What we're seeing is Israel building illegal settlements, 350 plus illegal settlements on Palestinian land, confiscated land from Palestinians, installing hundreds and hundreds of checkpoints that only make the life of Palestinians miserable. These are not the acts and the actions of a state or a government that wants peace. Netanyahu himself has boasted, saying, as the current prime minister said, over the years he has done everything he can to prevent a Palestinian state. Just recently, the foreign minister of Israel said it is not a good time to have a Palestinian state. The finance minister, an ultra-right individual, has talked about this is a great moment now with a Trump administration to actually take over and announce Israeli authority over the West Bank. So these are not the acts of a country or a government that wants peace, let alone that actually the Arab countries, Arab League in 2002 offered, after a summit in Beirut in Lebanon, my hometown, they offered Israel peace, the famous Arab Peace Initiative, which was pretty fair in a sense that it offered Israel full recognition, full diplomatic relations, full normalization with a complete withdrawal, as the UN resolutions require. UN Resolution 242 requires for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories, West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, and allow a Palestinian state to be established. For the Palestinians, gestures of peace would be very simple. Allowing a Palestinian state, number one. Number two, allowing for the refugees to return to their homeland. Now, as a non-Palestinian, as someone who's interested in human rights and peace in that region, I would say there are two solutions. Hopefully the third option is not an option. All-out war, a genocide, I know neither you nor me consider that as a viable, humane solution. The two humane solutions would be either a one state in which Palestinians, Israelis, with all their backgrounds and diversity, can celebrate having one country that is multinational, multi-ethnic, which is how the world is today, like in America, where everyone's rights are respected. Everyone has equal rights, equal responsibilities, and together they build a country. Look at, I know you have Muslim friends, Christian friends, Muslim, Arab, same thing. I have Jewish friends, and we get along together, even when we disagree. We only want what's best, because what is good for you is good for me. What's good for your children is good for my children. The other option, obviously, is a two-state solution where we create some clear, free, independent Palestinian state on the land of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, where Palestinians own their own affairs. They own their land. They own the access to the sea. They own the space. They can build a seaport where they can build an airport, unlike what was offered to them during the Oslo Agreement and the Camp David agreements, where it was a pseudo-state where they have little control over their land, let alone not even control over their entire land of what was historic Palestine.
So in its defense in 1967, Israel, yes, took back land in war, which it won in war, and said, you don't get land back until you make peace with us, until you recognize Israel and say, we have the right to exist, we have the right to survive, you do not present an existential threat, we have to know we have a future in this Middle East. You do not get that land back. And yes, Israel held on to that land because there has been no assurance or reassurance from the Palestinians, from Palestinian Authority, from the PLO, from Yasser Arafat, from Mahmoud Abbas, from anyone, from Hamas, that Israel can live there in peace. In fact, Hamas's own charter, I believe based in the 80s, says no Jews allowed. They will not rest until Israel is annihilated from the Mideast map and it is there no more. So I hear you with the argument, but I believe that when you omit certain facts, it doesn't give the totality of the argument for so many people who are trying to affect change and say there has to be a solution. So that's one point. Then you talked sort of about, and my words are not going to be verbatim, so forgive me, how the Palestinians are sort of in this landlocked area and Israel is locking them into that land. And I say to so many of my amazing Palestinian Muslim friends, if you can just sort of back away from this equation and take a viewpoint in a more objective way, it is the Palestinians' own leadership, because you were talking leadership. Hamas, Hezbollah keeps intervening on behalf of Hamas when for the last couple of decades, there has been no war between Lebanon and Israel in terms of Israel said, you're right, do your own thing, correct? And so on October 8th, the day after the October 7th Hamas attack, the brutal, horrific, savage attack on Israel, Hezbollah jumped in on October 8th and started launching its missiles and its rockets and its drones in support of Hamas. There was no need for that. And so I believe when we talk about leadership, is Bibi Netanyahu perfect? Certainly not. Is there a perfect solution? Certainly not. You mentioned the Oslo Accords. Was a potential statehood for the Palestinians and Israel's statehood the perfect equation? No. But it was a start to something great. I believe that when the Palestinians are suffering so much, let's give the Palestinians a good part of that land that was rightfully theirs in the UN partition in 1948, which the Palestinians rejected. You know, they want eventually all of Jerusalem. As you know, they're saying right now we're content with East Jerusalem. There's a lot of land that is still in contention. So when you're a suffering people, that your own people are causing the suffering, Let's begin somewhere. Let's start with your own statehood, your own land. You need human rights, you need civil rights, you need dignity, you need schools, you need mosques, you need daycare centers, you need universities, you need bridges, roads, tunnels. And I don't mean the tunnels that are being built underground, the billions of dollars spent every year in European Union and United States money to fight Israel. I'm talking about money that's given to them every year, because that is a solution. The Palestinians could have an amazing state. Why don't they take some of that money to build an above ground infrastructure to begin a solution then, rather than amass weapons and build an underground concrete maze of a tunnel system? So I believe that there has to be some sort of meeting of a brain trust and understand that there are two arguments to be listened to, but we can't omit all the facts. So when you present the facts, and I hear you, and I'm so appreciative that we're discussing this, but there's certain context that has to be given. So when everybody wants to say, well, Israel is a occupier, they're an oppressor, this is an apartheid state, I believe there could be nothing further from the truth, because Israel is the only nation in a 22 Arab nation world in the Mideast that says, you are welcome here. Come into our country, become a citizen, be a member of the Knesset, on our parliament, on our Congress. It is not done anywhere else. And so those acts of kindness have to be built upon, but you can't omit fact. And I think we have to begin there with the infrastructure. Is everything perfect that the Israelis do? Certainly not. And anyone who says that, they are a Pollyanna. To see the innocent civilian deaths in Gaza, it is heartbreaking, the women and the children, it is heartbreaking. But another solution is Hamas and Hezbollah, for that matter, never fight conventional warfare. They bury themselves amid the hospitals and the daycare centers and the schools. What is Israel to do? Israel is the only nation in the history of the world that gets on the phone and calls leaders and says, we are going to be here, we're going to be there. Or they drop leaflets days, weeks in advance and say, we are going to be there, we're going to be there. When you are at war with a terrorist who fights underground and uses human shields of women and children, it's difficult. It's not perfect on the Israeli side. I am not a Pollyanna. I want to see a two-state solution. I want there to be peace. But when we have this open, honest dialogue, we have to bring more facts to the table, because when Israel is continually demonized and vilified, it only creates more anti-Semitism. And so many people, whether it's the UN or university professors or presidents of universities or protesters at universities all throughout the streets of the nation, are saying death to Israel, death to Jews. But then they say, well, it's really the Zionism and it's the government. There is a veneer of anti-Semitism, and to have an honest discussion, that has to be accepted. I let you retort. Thank you.
I was so tempted to interrupt so many times because
you.
facts are important. I agree with you. And I'm going to go over a few, at least, perspectives on facts.
Thank you.
On the 1967 war, Israel initiated this war. There's no debate in history about that. It was not Arab countries that initiated that war. It was Israel initiated that war and led to the occupation of the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza and the Golan Heights, which Israel illegally annexed from Syria again. Israel has a long history of engaging in illegal behavior. Israel is in violation of about 70 UN resolutions, Security Council and General Assembly, including the right of return for the Palestinians, one of the earliest resolutions, 194. The resolution about ending the occupation. Now, what I was talking about when I said land grab, I was talking about after the occupation, after the invasion and the occupation of the Palestinian territories, Israel engaged in what the UN would consider a violation of international law. It's actually genocidal to force people, it's called ethnic cleansing, force people out of their homes. This is way after 1948, after Israel destroyed 400 Palestinian villages and towns and forced 750,000 Palestinians out. This is in the West Bank and Gaza, where Israel continues to grab land, annex land, building settlements where only Jews can live in these settlements. Only Jews can drive to on roads from Israel proper to these settlements, illegal settlements. Israelis have access to Palestinian water. They can build swimming pools. Palestinians have to struggle for drinking water. They can't even collect rain water without being fined by Israel in their own land, in the West Bank. You mentioned Israel is the only land in the region that tells people welcome. No, that's not correct. It's the only country that actually allows people in on the basis of their religion. A Palestinian can never be allowed into Israel, unless they probably all convert to Judaism. Maybe that is a solution.
So why are there so many Palestinian Muslims and Arab Muslims in Israel?
Those are the original population. These are the indigenous people of Palestine who chose not to leave or were not forced to leave because they lived in the triangle, the Arab triangle in northern Israel, where it's still overwhelmingly over a majority. You know, these are the 150,000 Palestinians, indigenous Palestinians, who stayed when Israel declared its state. Now they became about 2 million of almost 20% of the population of Israel. Those people stayed, and Israel has done everything it can to make their lives difficult. You know, there's little debate among Israelis of human rights backgrounds that Palestinians are treated the way black people were treated in the 50s and the 40s and before the civil rights movement and civil rights laws. They don't have equal access to education. It's not the same funding. Even when we talk about safety, Israelis, who are not Palestinian, who are not Muslim or Christian, have safety bomb shelters. Arabs or Palestinians in Israel don't have the same funding. But that's all besides on the side point. You mentioned also the issue dealing with Gaza, what's going on. What ICC, the International Court, Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, what so many countries, what every human rights organization has described as a genocide or potentially acts towards a genocide, have described. Israel has destroyed literally every single school in Gaza, almost every university, most of the hospitals and the clinics, has targeted people in shelters that it declared safe places. Israel did not have to kill 17,000 people to kill Hamas. This is not a war. This is actually, at this point, collective punishment, something that we've seen other brutal governments do to people when they engage in resistance. The Palestinian people have the right to resist an occupation. This is not, terrorism is one, and I would not have a second thought about it. An innocent person is targeted, whether it's Israeli or Palestinian, it should be unequivocally condemned. I will never hesitate as a human rights activist. But to target Israeli military occupation, that is the right of the Palestinian people. It's not terrorism for them. And Israel has no right under international law to punish the Palestinian people, children. What we're talking about today is targeting of aid workers, targeting of journalists. Over 200 journalists have been killed. Hundreds of aid workers, of medical staff have been killed, wounded, or arrested by Israel. 10,000 Palestinians are illegally detained as hostages by Israel way before October 7th. And the reason this doesn't help the future, I know we're debating what is happening today, but for me is unless we acknowledge the gross human rights violations that are happening today, how do we expect Palestinians to accept? How do we expect the whole neighborhood? Israel, I'm sure you know that very well, of course, so I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, but for the viewers, Israel is not in Nebraska or near Nebraska or Omaha. Israel is in the middle of 2 billion Muslims, 400 million Arabs, in a neighborhood that actually is angry as they watch on social media today, beheaded children, dismembered children, Palestinians being burned alive. It doesn't help peace. Even if Israel offers peace today, I worry that there is little trust that exists, little confidence today in the leadership. I am all for a leadership on the Palestinian side, on the Israeli side, on the Arab side, that shows steps towards building of confidence. I feel the Arab government, including the PLO, by the way, the PLO has accepted a two-state solution long time ago. Even Hamas changed its charter and acknowledged and accepted, said we will accept a two-state solution. The only one in the whole region that has said no is Israel. And I do believe there was a time when many Israelis were leaning towards that. I think I hope now we see a revival of that movement.
So they accept a two-state solution, but again, omitting facts isn't fair to the viewer because they expect a two-state solution, however, on their terms.
What are the terms?
Well, the terms are they want all of Jerusalem. They want Israel to comply with certain things. Israel its people are frightened people, and history has demonstrated overwhelmingly that Israel has a right to be concerned about its security. When you have neighbors surrounding you who, again, want to annihilate you and eliminate you from the map and have called for nothing no less than the 6 million Jews that were murdered during the Holocaust, and Iran, through its proxies Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and too many more to be named, have declared to the world that we will not rest until Israel suffers the fate the European Jews suffered in the concentration camps, and Hamas takes its marching orders and Hezbollah takes its marching orders from Iran, and no one says anything and the world says nothing. I question how, and not you, a person of great faith and great conviction, but how people can say, well, Israel doesn't want peace. Again, is there crime against humanity that I have asked for recognition to survive, to allow them to prosper, to allow them to have a land, to allow them to exist? Again, there is not one leader who has said, we recognize Israel's right to exist. And I'm talking about in the Arab world as far as the people attacking Israel. They are not going to be happy until Israel is there no more. So this all has to be put into context. So let's advance the story in our last few minutes.
But can I quickly
Yes,
comment on that?
please.
Because this might be 20 years ago. Today, almost all the Arab countries, either openly or privately, have recognized Israel.
But not Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, and that's the source of the terror.
Iran is almost in conflict with the entire region. It has little allies in the region.
That's true.
Hamas is an organization. It's not even the official representative of the Palestinian people. It's not even the PLO. Hezbollah is another organization. And I can assure you, these organizations will have no existence. You know what does Hamas stand for? In Arabic, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. It's the Islamic movement for resistance. Hezbollah calls itself the Islamic resistance. The minute that occupation ends, nobody would even waste their time talking to this group because they are the byproduct of an occupation.
Yet there's a difference, Hussam, when you say resistance. That's really sugarcoating the argument. There's resistance, and then there's brutal, savage terrorists. And so to co-join and co-mingle those two words is somewhat disingenuous to the public. They are a terrorist organization who seeks nothing but the destruction of Israel. End of story. So,
well, I'll have to disagree on this one. I would say the premise of their existence is resistance. The premise of Israel's existence is to protect its people. The premise of the existence of the Israeli army is to protect the Israeli state. Have they both, all sides, committed acts that we can easily, clearly describe as terrorism? Absolutely, right? But it doesn't deny the premise of their existence. Why? The context of why they exist. What I'm saying is those groups, including PLO and Fatah and the PFLP, would not exist if there's no more occupation. So for us, what we need to do is recognize today's reality. The reality is today everybody's tired. The Middle East is just, people want to move on, right? They want to have peace. They want to be able to have a future for their children. But for us to dwell on, okay, well, Hamas doesn't want to exist. Well, the Likud party doesn't want to, it doesn't solve the problem. What we need to do is make sure that deal with states, international law. The international law requires an end of that occupation.
Can I invite you back for another two-part series in the next few months so we can further this discussion? I am so appreciative of you being here and allowing us to have a dialogue. I know the format is different for our viewers. I have never done anything like this. You asked me if we could have a one-on-one interview, and I said, you know what? I will not silence, censor, or cancel your voice because there is not someone from a representative of the Jewish community. You had asked for it to have an interview as a one-on-one, and I am so appreciative of the content you gave, and I hope we continue our discussion. This has been informative, and I believe that this is a talk that must be had and must be continued.
Absolutely. I mean, I know, I recognize these are not easy discussions and topics, but they have to be made, because at the end of the day, we want to see people over there thrive the way we thrive here. We can disagree. We have left, right, liberals, conservatives. We just finished a difficult election. I think the people in that region deserve to have the same harmony, future opportunities for their children, and I hope it will happen.